Hello, my name is Rashi Srivastav and today we will be continuing with literary criticism, to be specific, romantic criticism, and the focus today will be on Samuel Taylor Coleridge's work Biographia Literaria. But before we move on to him, let us recollect what we did in Wordsworth's class. So in Wordsworth, we studied his essay Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Before moving on to Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, it is important that we understand Coleridge's relationship to Wordsworth and why he wrote Biographia Literaria as a consequence of that relationship with Wordsworth. To be precise, Biographia Literaria that was published in 1817 was an evaluation and exposition of Wordsworth's poetry. Coleridge was a great admirer of Wordsworth, and he declared Wordsworth to be the third greatest English poet after Shakespeare and Milton. However, in spite of such admiration, Coleridge did not agree to some of the ideas proposed by Wordsworth in his Preface to Lyrical Ballads, such as he disagrees with the use of the language of men, and he objects to Wordsworth's eulogization of the language of rustics. According to him, he says that Wordsworth is making a contradictory statement where on one hand he wants us to use the language of rustics, the language of men, but on the other hand Wordsworth is also proposing something known as selection, and this is something we talked about in the previous session. Coleridge establishes that the basic difference between prose and poetry is meter. He reiterates that meter is not just some superficial charm that adds variety to poetry. In fact, meter is the basic difference between prose and poetry, something that Wordsworth had done away with. So, in short, Coleridge felt that Wordsworth was not practicing what he was preaching. After this relation between Coleridge and Wordsworth, we can now move to the main text, Biographia Literaria, and we can study that in detail. So, as I said, it was published in 1817, and it can be said to be a literary autobiography of Coleridge. In fact, it is an autobiography, it is a work of literary criticism, and it is also a work of metaphysical speculation. Here in this text, we will study two major and important chapters of Biographia Literaria. In chapters 13 and 14, he will give the major ideas that were prevalent in Biographia Literaria. The ideas of fancy and imagination, and the idea of poetry and poem, along with the idea of the willing suspension of disbelief. Let us start with a brief introduction about Biographia Literaria and about the idea that Coleridge had while writing down Biographia Literaria before we move to the two main chapters of study. So, first of all, what is this work? We must remember that Coleridge was greatly influenced by German intellectuals and writers such as Kant and Schelling, and most importantly Immanuel Kant, because we will see a reflection of Kantian ideas onto the ideas produced by Coleridge. So, Biographia Literaria was actually a perceptive criticism on Wordsworth's poetry, and it was a statement on the theory of creative imagination that was put forward by Coleridge. So, as opposed to Wordsworth's theory of poetry and poetic diction, here Coleridge is putting forth his theory of creative imagination. In fact, Arthur Symons has justly described this work to be the greatest book of English criticism. The theory of creative imagination was given in chapters 13 and 14, which we will study in detail today. Sorry. In this text, Coleridge attempts to define nature and the self. He tries to draw a relation between the objective and the subjective. According to him, nature was objective while the self was subjective, and it was a culmination of nature and self, or of the objective and the subjective, that resulted in the creation of pure knowledge. Moving to chapter 13, let us talk about fancy and imagination. Let us consider fancy and imagination. What were these terms and why did Coleridge draw a relation between fancy and imagination? I would like to quote by saying that fancy and imagination were two distinct and widely different faculties instead of being, according to the general belief, either two names with one meaning or at furthest the lower and higher degree of one and the same power, unquote. So, in short, what Coleridge was proposing is that fancy and imagination were not synonymous to each other. In fact, they were two completely different objects, where fancy was a little bit lower in hierarchy to imagination. They were completely different things, as Coleridge has put forward. Fancy is something that he takes from 18th century view of imagination, something that is mechanical and was determined by the law of association. He assigns a minor role to fancy, but we can see that fancy for him holds a pejorative term. In fact, he sees it as something that is not very great as compared to imagination. In contrast to fancy, imagination was essentially creative. In fact, some critics have said that Coleridge considered Milton to have an imaginative mind, while Abraham Cowley had a fanciful mind. Moving to imagination, that Coleridge further divides into primary and secondary imagination, let us move to that area in the text where he talks about imagination. Let us focus on the highlighted area. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, in the infinite I am. If we consider this statement given by Coleridge, it is important to understand the relation that he draws to Descartes, the philosopher, who gave this very popular statement, I think, therefore I am. So here, primary imagination is being reduced, or is rather it's being elevated to the elemental power of basic human perception that enables us to identify, discriminate and synthesize to produce order out of disorder. It is a living example of the term I am. It is a living power and prime agent of all human perception. Secondary imagination, also known as artistic imagination, coexists with the conscious will and is different in degree and mode of operation from primary imagination. It is also important to understand that imagination has been defined by Coleridge as an esemplastic power. Esemplastic is a term that Coleridge himself has coined, which means unifying. So, imagination is a unifying power. Fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space. So, on one hand, where imagination perhaps is said to be more original, fancy is based on memory. This is the major point with which he ends his chapter 13, talking about the important factor of fancy and imagination. Moving over to chapter 14, we will understand Coleridge's relationship with the German scholars and how they affected this idea of imagination and fancy. But before that, it is important that we take a look at Kant's theory of imagination and understanding, also known as Kant's theory of imagination and reason. Now, this theory was the groundwork on which Coleridge based his work of fancy and imagination. So, on one hand we have Kant, who has given similar entities, and on the other hand we have Coleridge, who perhaps is drawing from them and developing new ideas along similar lines. So, where Coleridge gave fancy, Kant had already given reproductive imagination. Where Coleridge termed primary imagination, Kant had already given productive imagination. And similarly, what Coleridge called secondary imagination, Kant had already called reason. In fact, reason and secondary imagination were mediated by rationality and understanding by means of symbol. So, this is an important groundwork from where Coleridge draws his inspiration to talk about fancy and imagination. Now, let us move to chapter 14. Chapter 14 begins with an interesting dialogue and an interesting phase where Coleridge has almost coined this phase known as the willing suspension of disbelief. We will get into the origin of this phrase and how it came into existence and why did Coleridge coin it. So, the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment refers to the willingness to suspend one's critical faculties and to believe in something unreal. To be precise, this is the sacrifice of realism and logic for the sake of excitement. The origin of this phrase can be traced down to Aristotle's idea of catharsis, where the audience accepts fiction as reality by attaching their real emotions onto it. Why did Coleridge give rise to such a frame? This term resulted from an experiment that Coleridge and Wordsworth had conducted with each other, where both had to produce poetry. Where Coleridge had to produce poetry based on supernatural elements and he was writing poems like The Dark Lady and Christabel, Wordsworth had to produce poetry based on semblance of truth, and as a result of which he produced lyrical ballads. However, while writing down lyrical ballads and in its publication, Wordsworth came with an altogether new theory called the theory of poetry and poetic diction that we saw in his preface to Lyrical Ballads. Now, this is something that Coleridge did not concur with, and he moved on to explain the basic difference between a poetry and poem, and this is what we will see in chapter 14. The basic distinction between poetry and poem. If we consider poetry, we see poetry can be said to be most forms of imaginative literature and fine arts, with an immediate end of pleasure. The important part is the immediate end of pleasure, because objective is something that we have to keep in mind while differentiating between poetry and a poem. Poetry can or cannot include unrhymed imaginative writing. Whereas on the other hand, a poem has elements of imaginative prose composition in a different manner for a different perspective, with an objective that may be recollection, communication of truth, or even pleasure. So, in short, poetry and poem are more or less the same, but with a difference in their combination and objective. A poem is more organic, where each part of it mutually supports and explains every other part of it. And the source of this organic process is the poet. Pleasure and truth that Coleridge seems to see as separate were given by both poetry and science. Science played a major role during that time because of the Industrial Revolution that we talked about in the first session, and we will see even while reading Biographia Literaria that even Coleridge makes use of the terminology of science, of the jargon of science when he wants to explain his ideas of literature. So that brings us to the end of chapter 14, where the major ideas discussed are the willing suspension of disbelief and the distinction between poetry and poem. Now, since we are looking at romantic criticism, and Wordsworth and Coleridge are two major aspects of this age, let us draw a comparison between them. So, according to critics, when a comparison is drawn between the literary criticism produced by Wordsworth and that of Coleridge, is that Wordsworth is limited in scope as compared to Coleridge. Wordsworth is subjective, but Coleridge is both subjective and objective. Coleridge is concerned with shape, form and embodiment, which were relatively new ideas at that time, and this makes him to be a precursor of the new critics, not forgetting that he always considered meter to be an integral part of the poetic process. That is where we shall end this session, and we have now looked at Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads and Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. Thank you.